firstly, very excited to be launching the Australian Sustainable Finance Taxonomy. It was officially launched yesterday, and to be able to communicate and share what it is and what's next with all of you today. I do want to start by acknowledging the traditional custodians on the lands on which we meet throughout Australia. I am here on cold but beautiful Ngunnawal and Ngambri country in Canberra, and I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of this land, recognising their continuing and ongoing connection to country, and also acknowledging all the First Nations people that have contributed to this work throughout the development process. I'd like to pay my respects to elders past and present, and of course extend that respect to all First Nations people that may be with us on the call today. So I think before we get started on the nuts and bolts of the taxonomy, I would just like to hand over to Penny Serow from the Department of Treasury. Penny is, I think, acting First Assistant Secretary at the Department of Treasury, but ordinarily she leads the Australian government's work on the Sustainable Finance Agenda, and we're very pleased today to have Penny opening with a few remarks. So thank you very much, Penny.
Thanks very much, Nicole. And I just wanted to thank everyone for joining this webinar today to support the launch of the taxonomy. It's a real pleasure for me to be here to mark this important milestone. So on behalf of the Australian government, I wanted to congratulate ASFI as well as the Taxonomy Technical Expert Group for the outstanding work on the development of the taxonomy. This comes around 2 years after the announcement of the development of the taxonomy at the Treasurer's Investor Roundtable in 2023. And it's really great to now have the tool available for voluntary use. It's got technical criteria for 6 key sectors against the objective of climate mitigation, as well as important minimum social safeguards and do no significant harm criteria. So why is this important? Well, it really relates to Australia's legislated target to reach net zero emissions by 2050. There's a range of policies and frameworks in place to support mitigation, adaptation, as well as building a strong net zero economy. And as this year progresses, you'll all hear more about the 2035 targets, sectoral plans, as well as the Productivity Commission's work to support the net zero transformation. What we know is that private investment will play a crucial role in enabling the necessary transformation of Australia's economy. So sustainable finance reforms are a really important part of the policy landscape, and that's set out in the Sustainable Finance Roadmap. So the roadmap outlines steps to help modernise our financial markets and maximise opportunities associated with energy, climate and sustainability goals. And in large part, those reforms are about ensuring markets have access to high quality, credible and comparable information. There's supports like best practice transition planning guidance that we'll be consulting on soon. And we're also developing a labelling system for sustainable investment products. But ASFI's Sustainable Finance Taxonomy is a key part of the roadmap. Before 2023, the market was struggling with diverse approaches, and they sought consistent definitions of activities that contribute to climate change mitigation. The taxonomy is a framework to classify economic activities that positively contribute to sustainability objectives. A common framework that can help financial institutions identify investment and lending opportunities, support the comparability of investment products, and reduce transaction costs for due diligence. And indeed, many other countries have developed their own taxonomies, and there's examples in the EU, Singapore, South Africa and Indonesia, and developments underway in lots of other places. New Zealand and Brazil are just a couple of examples. So ASFI and the TTEG brought a high level of discipline to this task. They ensured the design process was consultative and transparent, It was important that stakeholders could see how input was considered, how decisions were made, and how scientific rigour was included through the process. And Treasury is confident that the process has delivered an ambitious and usable framework that's fit for purpose for the Australian context. Reflecting on the development journey, a couple of highlights or elements really stood out to me. One is the genuine co-design. So the taxonomy wasn't developed in a vacuum. It brought together perspectives from the finance sector, industry, academia, regulators, as well as government. And the process engaged stakeholders across a really wide cross-section of sectors through a few things: the composition of the TTEG, the technical advisory groups, as well as the 2 rounds of public consultation and the many other meetings and webinars that ASFI ran. What I observed is that both rounds of public consultation received a high volume of constructive submissions from a range of stakeholders, and this level of engagement really reinforced that the market is interested in a credible science-based taxonomy. The works also required navigating complex and at times contested territory. And we appreciate that ASFI and the TTEG approach this with care, openness, and a genuine willingness to consider competing perspectives. And this helped shape the product that reflects a balance between ambition and practicality. The second standout for me is the use of interoperability or international frameworks, as well as considering domestic priorities. So international interoperability was embedded by Treasury as a core design principle from the beginning. ASFI's taxonomy was developed with leading international frameworks in mind. These include the EU and Singapore. And the TTEG did seek to align approaches where possible, while also reflecting Australia's unique policy, sectoral and economic context. And an example of that I'm sure you'll hear more about today is the incorporation of First Nations considerations in the minimum social safeguards. Achieving both international interoperability and ensuring domestic fit together, it's not easy, but it is essential to ensure that Australian institutions can operate with confidence in both local and global markets. So this approach is central to the taxonomy's credibility, usability, and its value in the long term as a market tool. So what next? The taxonomy is now available as a voluntary tool. So piloting and testing the taxonomy's usability will be important to refining it further over time and as technologies change. Treasury strongly encourages industry to engage actively, test it, use it, help shape how it operates in practice. We're keenly interested in ASFI's taxonomy implementation pilot and the lessons that emerge from that. We'll engage with the lessons that emerge, and these insights can inform future decisions, both about the taxonomy's technical evolution and how it could be used in Australia and to support other countries with their own transitions. The government will continue to work closely with industry as it considers how the taxonomy can inform investment, reduce greenwashing, and support Australia's net zero transformation. From the government's perspective, enabling settings for sustainable finance remain a priority, and the taxonomy is a cornerstone of this. So thank you again to ASFI and the TTEG for bringing us this far. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Penny. So I guess I feel like Penny did such an excellent job of providing a good overview. We can motor through some of the other slides, but taking a little bit of a step back, just a little bit about ASFI, the Australian Sustainable Finance Institute. We are a not-for-profit, purpose-driven organisation, member-based organisation with a mission to reshape the financial system for a resilient, sustainable and inclusive Australia. Our members comprise financial institutions across the full finance sector value chain, from banks, asset owners and asset managers to financial intermediaries. As Penny mentioned, the taxonomy development process, you can go to the next slide, Grace. So just in terms of the structure, what we'll be doing very quickly is just providing a little bit of background and overview to the project itself. Then the role of the Australian Sustainable Finance Taxonomy and how it can operate. We'll go a little bit deeper into the design framework to give people a bit of a roadmap about what it is and what it entails, including the sectors, and then provide a little bit more information around next steps, including the taxonomy implementation pilot. So, like I said, going a little bit to the beginning, as Penny mentioned, it has been a long process to get to where we are, and that process really had collaboration and input at its core from the beginning. When ASFI was formed, off the back of an initiative from the finance sector and others across academia, civil society, regulators, they identified sort of key priorities for Australia moving forward in the net zero transformation. One of those recommendations was that Australia consider a sustainable finance taxonomy that is fit for purpose for the Australian context. When ASFI was established, it was one of the first key projects that we initiated, working with a broad-based advisory group of, I think, over 65 people from across finance, academia, experts, financial regulators, and at the time, an observation role from the Australian government. And really what we did is go through a process of identifying and analysing what is out there internationally and drawing on those lessons and key design elements to think about what is needed for an Australian taxonomy. We went out to consult and came out with a set of recommendations for how Australia should approach its own taxonomy, and at that point formed a partnership with the Australian government to develop an Australian Sustainable Finance Taxonomy. We really took the learnings and the input from those recommendations to pull together the framework, including 2 sets of methodology reports. We went out to consult in 2 sets of public consultation and have now got to the point of publishing the taxonomy yesterday in June 2025. So particularly the next phase, if you could just go back one, yes, was, like Penny mentioned, a strong collaboration from many people. We had the Australian government and the financial regulators, so that's the Reserve Bank of Australia, APRA and ASIC, who provided strategic oversight to the project. We had 25 senior leaders who were made up the taxonomy technical expert group. They were an independent decision-making body from across sustainable finance, climate, the environment, policy, human rights, and Indigenous rights and perspectives, who were the ultimate decision makers. We had over 84 experts across 8 advisory groups that provided key input, and including, key sectors and parts of the real economy. We collaborated with 18 peak bodies to ensure that the message got out there and that we were able to work with those peak bodies to get substantive and considered feedback back to us through the 2 public consultation periods. And we hosted over 80 targeted workshops and forums to ensure that everybody was able to have their say. As Penny mentioned, we received over 170 submissions that were really well considered and sought to really work with parties to incorporate that feedback so that we had a credible, usable and interoperable taxonomy. Go to the next slide. So I guess the question then is, we've spoken a bit about the how, but what is it? Really, it can be described in different ways. A classification system is, I think, the most accurate description. Other people talk about it as a sustainable dictionary. It really is a system that identifies at the activity level. So we're talking about assets or projects, investable economic activities across key sectors of the economy that actually make a substantial contribution to, in this case, for the Australian taxonomy, climate change mitigation. Really what taxonomies enable, it's a bit of a public good. It creates a starting point for conversations between investors or banks and the real economy players to be thinking about the investments that they want to make to capitalize on the green economic opportunities. That common language system really helps not only with identifying and facilitating investment in new green economic activities, but also helps reduce greenwashing and strengthens investor confidence. And this ultimately supports private capital towards a low carbon transition. It must also be noted what it doesn't do. It definitely does not tell companies or financial institutions what they can and cannot invest in. And it also doesn't assess the economic merits of any particular activity in the taxonomy. It doesn't make any judgment around those activities. It simply lists them and describes the performative requirements in order to be able to classify as a green economic activity. If we go to the next slide, and why, I guess, for the Australian economy is that we identified during the scoping phase that it's really important to look at the key parts of the Australian economy and ensure that we enable pathways for private finance into the areas that Australia really cares about. So thinking across, taking a whole of economy across and identifying and substantiating significant transition activities that can help drive Australia's unique path to net zero, and that includes key areas that haven't been covered in other taxonomies, like the mining and mineral sector or like the agricultural sector. It also is very supportive and so enables private capital to go to those key priority areas that the Australian government has identified in its in its climate and other policies. And so everybody's sort of pulling in the same direction and helps to integrate Australia-specific data, reporting, methodologies, starting points, proxies, so really kind of giving it relevance to the Australian context. So if we go to the next slide, Grace. I guess the question then becomes, how can it be used? And it is a tool that can be used in a range of different ways. It is out in the market for voluntary use and can be used as a use of proceeds. So this is where the finance goes for green labeled debt issuances to support the identification of opportunities as people are looking at their climate related disclosures, to screen for new opportunities if people want to allocate new climate solutions or targets, and to help guide and set investment decisions and targets. It is also, as we said, a very helpful conversation starter and an engagement tool between finance sector and the real economy in terms of helping to allocate capital towards those opportunities. If we go to the next slide. I guess where it fits in, and I think Penny covered this off well, the Australian government has put out a sustainable finance strategy and put out a roadmap that identifies sort of 3 key pillars, and the Australian Sustainable Finance Taxonomy fits into that pillar 1 of improving transparency on climate and sustainability. If we go to the next slide. And I think just worth mentioning the key design principles that have guided the development process, the consultation process, and the ultimate results of the taxonomy are credibility, usability, and interoperability. It's really important, and this was a key design element built in from the beginning, that the taxonomy is there to really capture and increase the flow of green capital to Australia's green economic opportunities. In order to do that, it needs to be credible and aligned to international capital market standards and utilize key global reference frameworks. And this is exactly what we've done. But also being very pragmatic in making sure that it is usable, that we're taking into account Australia's starting point, using Australia-specific data and information. And I think usability is going to come into sharp focus as we pilot the taxonomy to see where and how it's being used and whether any adjustments and improvements can be made to that usability component. Lastly, interoperability, as Penny mentioned, we have drawn very extensively on other benchmark reference taxonomies, particularly the EU, but also Singapore and others, and building on, I think, the body of work that is out there. We have not reinvented the wheel, so the work that we have done in key areas where we've gone out ahead is additive to, not different from, other taxonomies. So I might hand over to Grace now to take us through a little bit more of the technical detail on the key elements. Thanks, Grace.
Thanks, Nicole. Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. I'm going to take us through the key elements of a sustainable finance taxonomy and explain sort of what that means for the Australian taxonomy as well. I appreciate that for a lot of you who have been on this journey, this is probably something you're well and truly across by now, but for those joining us for the first time today, hopefully it's a useful introduction. So basically the three key elements of a taxonomy are the technical screening criteria, the do no significant harm criteria, and minimum social safeguards. So technical screening criteria are applied at an activity level, and this means that each activity covered in the taxonomy has to include technical screening criteria. They're the performance requirements that must be met for an activity to be assessed as taxonomy aligned. Do no significant harm criteria are also applied at an activity level. They're included to ensure that activities that meet the technical screening criteria aligned with a given environmental objective. So in the Australian taxonomy, that's climate change mitigation, don't cause significant harm to other environmental objectives, which I'll talk to in the next slide. It's important to note that meeting the do no significant harm criteria does not mean an activity makes a positive contribution to the objectives covered by the do no significant harm criteria. And lastly, minimum social safeguards criteria are somewhat distinct from the technical screening criteria and do no significant harm criteria in that they apply at an entity level. They're designed to ensure that an entity that seeks to demonstrate its activities are taxonomy aligned, also meets minimum corporate governance standards, and adheres to a defined set of social norms in relation to human rights and First Nations rights and cultural heritage. So these are the 6 environmental objectives covered by the Australian taxonomy. They're climate change mitigation, climate change adaptation and resilience, biodiversity and ecosystem protection, sustainable use and protection of water resources, pollution prevention and control, and transition to a circular economy. They're fully aligned with the EU taxonomy's environmental objectives and closely aligned with the Singapore and ASEAN taxonomy's environmental objectives. In version 1 of the Australian taxonomy, we have focused on climate change mitigation for the technical screening criteria. This means that sectors and activities have been chosen based on their contributions to this environmental objective only. Performance criteria, that is the technical screening criteria, must be met for an activity to be classified as green or transition, and this is defined according to the activity's emissions-related performance. There are no technical screening criteria corresponding to the other environmental objectives in version 1 of the taxonomy. What the other environmental objectives do have is do no significant harm criteria. So the do no significant harm criteria aim to ensure that activities that meet those performance thresholds set out in the technical screening criteria for climate change mitigation do not cause significant harm to the taxonomy's other environmental objectives. There are 2 types of do no significant harm criteria in the Australian taxonomy. There's generic criteria and specific criteria. Generic do no significant harm criteria are principles and process-based, and they're defined for each of the 5 environmental objectives covered by the do no significant harm framework. Specific do no significant harm criteria detail specific requirements for some activities based on the material impacts of those activities if they're not otherwise covered by the generic criteria. Finally, for the minimum social safeguards, we have established criteria across 3 core pillars: corporate governance, human rights, and First Nations rights and cultural heritage. These apply at an entity level, as I said before, and cover a range of core topics underneath those 3 pillars, basically to ensure that an entity meets minimum standards in relation to a defined set of social norms. And these have been drawn from a range of different sources, including the OECD guidelines for multinational enterprises on responsible business conduct, the UN guiding principles on business and human rights, and the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. So I might pass to Michael now to talk through the sector and activity selection for the taxonomy.
Thank you very much, Grace, and lovely to see you all here today. So I guess the prioritization and what's guided our selection of sectors and activities, and really it's been weighted upon these questions, is really how does the sector make a contribution to Australia's current emissions? So looking at that emissions share piece, its role in facilitating the transition. So is this sector critical in facilitating or enabling Australia's pathway to net zero? in line with 1.5 scenarios? And thirdly, what does a low carbon economic opportunity look like? So does it sector include activities that represent really important and valuable low carbon economic opportunities for Australia in the context of a Paris-aligned transition? And what this has led to, if we go to the next slide, please, is 6 sectors and 71 activities that are covered in this version of the taxonomy. Now, of course, most of these sectors are also represented in key reference taxonomies like the EU taxonomy and the Singaporean taxonomy. But I think where the Australian taxonomy has delved into new ground is in the mining sector, where we're the first taxonomy really to put out criteria that's been closely watched and followed in other jurisdictions around mining for critical and strategic minerals. And also agriculture and land, which is, historically, I guess, underserved in sustainable finance markets, but can have incredibly large economic and climate mitigation co-benefits. So the 71 activities we've selected will not be exhaustive. The taxonomy is a living document and will be expanded over time, but these have been selected by the TTEG and the technical advisory groups in each sector, based on what the biggest levers to decarbonisation are for the Australian economy and where those opportunities really lie. Now, when it comes to activity selection and classification methodology, there are essentially 3 paths to green classification in the Australian taxonomy covering climate change mitigation. The first is really your classic lower zero emission substitutes, so things such as renewable energy, energy efficiency technologies, clean transportation, etc. The second is the enabling activities, so those that really support other activities which truly decarbonize the economy directly, including low emissions technologies, thinking, for example, the manufacturing of electrolyzers, or also low carbon transport infrastructure, which can enable mode shifting. And I think the third thing to keep in mind in the third path is high performing, hard to abate activities, which is really where mining fits in, agriculture fits in, and in the manufacturing and industry sector, cement fits in, and a range of other activities, which are really pivotal in an economy-wide transition in Australia. And of course, the question that really sets a litmus test for whether an activity has been included in version 1 is whether that activity has a stable or growing demand in a net zero economy aligned with a 1.5 pathway. So those 71 activities across 6 sectors have been run through that filter to ensure that they do. Now, when it comes to how these classifications compare to some of the key reference taxonomies, the green criteria or classification really tracks very closely to the EU. So the first is the substantial contribution or taxonomy aligned category in the EU taxonomy. Both taxonomies have enabling activities which very closely reference ICMA's guidance for green enabling projects. And the third classification, which is very consistent with the EU, is the high performing, hard to abate activities, which track very closely to the transitional criteria in the EU taxonomy. Where our taxonomy really differs or provides an augmented approach is in the transition classification. If we could go to the next slide, please. Which we really look at through the lens of the following statement. Does this activity follow on a 1.5 pathway? And if it does, we want to be able to provide a pathway for activities that do not meet the green criteria to have access to decarbonisation measures, which comprise processes, things like process efficiencies and other material fuel switching and other material decarbonisation measures that can bring whole activities into closer alignment with the green classification. So in contrast to the EU taxonomy, I guess, which provides a kind of binary yes, no, comply, the Australian taxonomy also provides for those entities that can not meet the green criteria, kind of discrete technologies, processes, etc., that can inform their CapEx programs, that can inform OpEx, and can be a real translation tool between financial institutions and real economy sector to guide how decarbonisation can happen to bring it in line with a 1.5 pathway. And so the real benefit of these decarbonisation measures, which have been sourced from the CCA, from CSIRO, and from other world-leading research across Europe and North America and other jurisdictions, is to provide options to materially reduce emissions for existing assets that are important and have a stable or growing role in a Paris-aligned transition, and also for hard-to-abate activities with no low or zero emissions equivalent. Next slide, please. And to give just a little example of this, to try and de-abstract it a little bit, I'll walk you through the lithium ore mining criteria. So you'll see the green classification here very much uses emissions-related performance criteria as the base. So provides a few different options for meeting that criteria because of the variance between mine sites in terms of the downstream processing that is included on site. But where a mine site or specific facility cannot meet that green criteria, they won't be able to call the whole activity green according to the climate change mitigation objective, but they will be able to access decarbonisation measures. So things like fuel switching, electrification, trolley assist, which reduces fuel use associated with hauling. And by doing so, be able to make some progress and be represented in the taxonomy in a way that does support them to move towards alignment with the green criteria over time. Next slide, please. And just to zoom back out, after going through a whistle-stop tour of the activity selection and classification, I wanted to just draw a broad comparison. You know, we spoke about interoperability before, as mentioned by Nicole and Penny. The Australian, the EU, and Singapore taxonomies are remarkably aligned in our design. The temperature alignment is the same, following the highest objective under the Paris Agreement. The scenario selection is very much similar. So Singapore's uses the IEA. We also use the IEA as our global reference, but are very fortunate to have downscaled versions of the IEA's times model in Australia in use by CSIRO and Climate Works Centre, who use an Oz times model, which downscales that to the Australian context. And so we've been fortunate to use that. The EU also uses modelling that is considered 1.5 aligned, but doesn't refer to the IEA specifically. Where an Australian taxonomy is really important is in that criteria formulation piece. So the Australian modelling in particular uses Australian starting points, and we've been able to draw really well from them. In the mining sector criteria, for example, where we needed a larger sample size, we used 20% best performing mines globally as a sort of starting point for those emissions intensity thresholds, which ratchet down according to a 1.5 pathway. That is similar in some cases to the EU, but different in other cases where the EU has its own ETS starting points, you know, top 10% installations. And it's very similar to Singapore's taxonomy, which uses the IEA kind of global modeling for their emissions intensity starting points. Similarly, DNSH very much tracks along existing Australian environmental regulation that is consistent with a lot of the mapping that we did to see where we could bring in international proxies, and with a few exceptions, Australian environmental regulation is kind of what we use to underpin that. And MSS, similarly, we use domestic regulation and international standards, as Grace spoke about a little bit earlier, and that is consistent very much with the approaches taken in the EU and in Singapore. So I guess the big question after all of that is really next steps. So as Nicole mentioned before, this is out in the world now, and we would be delighted for everyone to use it to guide the allocation of capital towards credible transition-related opportunities. Similarly, we are really looking as ASFI at market development. So I guess how we can contribute to continuous improvement and uptake in the taxonomy over time. So we're collaborating with the AOFM and state treasury corporations to develop taxonomy-aligned labelled bond guidance. As Nicole foreshadowed earlier, we are also partnering with 9 financial institutions to voluntarily pilot the taxonomy across a range of use cases. And the objective there is to really pick up on what those highest value use cases in the Australian context can be, where some of that usability shakes out. So where technical screening criteria might need to be modified to make it more usable, and where it really works in version 2, and also looking at where kind of sectoral coverage in the future can go with the Australian taxonomy. And that's already, I guess, implicit in what I just said, but the taxonomy is a live document, and I think that's a really important point. This is version 1, but it's by no means the last version. So we will be trying to, through our market development processes and also other avenues, really read the tea leaves about what can go into version 2 to add further value and make this a more useful backstage tool in sustainable finance markets.
Thank you all. To hear about the Australian Sustainable Finance Taxonomy, this recording will be available on our website, and encourage everyone to go have a look around and engage in the resources that are available there. So thank you all very much.